Hey everyone, told you I wasn't done yet. Today I want to talk about the underutilized subclasses, those being both Strand and Stasis. These subclasses I believe to be the most underused subclasses on an average use basis across all three classes for endgame activities and even some early game activities as well. Of course this is from a PvE standpoint as I don't engage with PvP. So getting right into it, these are Destiny's Forgotten subclasses. Ever since their introductions in Beyond Light and Lightfall, Stasis and Strand haven't really been updated or had any meaningful additions in a long time. Both classes have had their kits stay relatively the same over the years. From their aspects to their abilities, everything has stayed the same with virtually no changes. There is an exception, but I'll get to that later. While there have been slight alterations to stats given from fragments and some balancing adjustments here and there, I wouldn't really count these as an addition or meaningful change to the subclass. For example, having Whisper of Torment give -10 grenade stat doesn't really change an entire build's performance or potency. The Dark subclasses have stayed the same, whereas their siblings, the Light subclasses, have had many additions such as new supers and new aspects. To be honest, I really don't even think that Bungie could add any more to the Light subclasses. I think they've added so much that anything more would noticeably unbalance them with the other subclasses. Each subclass has 3 to 4 aspects, a lot of fragments, and most of them have a choice of 7 different grenades, multiple melee options, and 2 to 3 supers total, whereas both Strand and Stasis have only 1 melee, 3 grenade options, 1 super, and albeit roughly the same amount of aspects and fragments. I feel as if this limits the build options quite significantly in variety and player choice. Aspects as a whole on these subclasses are a unique situation. The Stasis subclasses share one of the aspects already with Grim Harvest, Tectonic Harvest, and Glacial Harvest. All 3 of these do functionally the same thing, but the activation method is slightly altered on each class. Hunter activates on defeating slowed or frozen targets. Titans activates on shattering crystals or frozen targets. And Warlocks activates on freezing targets. But each of them just spawns stasis shards on activation. Strand's aspects are actually fairly good and all well balanced in my opinion, apart from one, but we'll get to that. Fragments are in a similar boat, all are roughly fine, but then again, fragments don't make up the bulk of a build and are rather background buffs for you that help. So getting to the point that most of you probably already see coming, this leaves the main abilities of the subclasses. The supers, the grenades, the melees, all of the parts that you actually play with in the subclass. These are the things that need additions to, especially with Prismatic in the play as well, since Prismatic takes the only super, melee, and to a lesser extent, grenades from these subclasses. It's been over 5 years since Stasis was introduced, and almost 3 years since Strand was introduced. Why has there not been any additions to these subclasses? Given that they're well designed, new supers and abilities would feel very nice to have. Yet there just hasn't really been anything done. There has been one addition though that is the exception I mentioned prior, Frost Armor. This ability / buff was announced right before Final Shape, given the fact that there wasn't a specific stasis buff for Prismatic to benefit off of. What this does is give you a stacking damage resist buff, where 1 stack is equal to 4.5% damage resist for 10 seconds, stacking up to 8 times with Whisper of Rhyme, for a total of 36% damage reduction. Compared to Woven Mail, which would be the equivalent to it, it gives 40%. You would think that Woven Mail is just better in almost every way compared to Frost Armor, and you'd be right. Everyone who runs Strand probably runs Threat of Warding, which gives Woven Mail on orb pickup for 5 seconds, but with how easy it is to make orbs, this is almost a null factor. For Frost Armor, you need to work harder depending on your subclass, and you get a less potent effect in return. Now, Frost Armor decayed on a per stack basis, as in once your stack of 8's timer ran out, you go to 7 stacks, there might be more discussion to be had. But I find it funny that the one addition to Stasis in the last 4 years fell so short of everything else compared to it. Frost Armor is still okay, don't get me wrong, but nothing that I feel made people want to play Stasis and continue to play Stasis. In summary, both Stasis and Strand need new abilities to help define themselves amongst the other subclasses and hold at least some dominance again. Getting the obvious exceptions out of the way, Stasis Hunter and Strand Titan. Stasis Hunter is the go-to speedrunner's pick mainly because of one ability's slightly glitchy nature, Shatter Dive. and of course you know I'm referring to shatter skating. The ability that lets you go approximately 2/3 the speed of sound when paired with Eager Edge. And I admit it, I like skating as it is. It's a pretty fun piece of tech that a lot of people use, and I don't see anything wrong with it. But why does that have to be the only thing that Stasis Hunter is good at? It could have better abilities to complement it. That is one of the only positives the class has for itself, hence why its use is only really for traversal and lower tier content. I also take back what I said and why I thought the worst subclass to play was. At the time being Strand Hunter, because when I did Stasis Hunter, I found it incredibly frustrating to play. I feel as if each of the darkness subclasses lack any kind of healing buff or effect, which is one of the reasons why I think the other classes are just stronger. However, the next exception breaks the rule with Strand Titan, and by extension Banner of War, the aspect that rewards you for playing Titan. There's a reason why the Banner of War aspect meme exists. It is that strong, free healing and melee damage boost. Ever since it got introduced in Season of the Witch, it's been a default pick for any Strand Titan build. Even with the nerfs it's received, it's still a very dominant pick, not to mention the OG way of grapple melee spam, which is still good. Not as strong as Hunter by any means, but still is a viable pick. But even with the power of Strand Titan, it's dull. It's been like this for over 2 years, and like I've said many of times already, it's got nothing new since then. The most recent update was when Fletched Storm was strong, but that was 10 months ago now. And even then, nothing new was added except the stat changes. But all that did was make the bad classes slightly better and make the already dominant classes even more dominant. Even though I believe these two classes are used very often and each for good reasons, it doesn't change the fact that nothing's been done with them in a very long time. Also, side rant, what the hell is this activity, by the way? Like, I know I don't engage with this game at all really anymore, and I haven't touched Portal in a long time, but still, what is this? I saw it in the solo ops and it looked new, but in reality it's just kill enemy waves, move the next room, kill enemies, and repeat. Nothing interesting about it. Granted, I have dialogue off, so maybe there was some enticing John Jakes level writing I missed, but come on. I couldn't even get through the entirety of it. I actually left after the second room just because it's that mundane. I see some things just don't change. Anyways. Now originally, this section was going to be about how the current abilities for the darkness subclasses were lacking in strength, and how when compared to other abilities they were below the curve. But upon thinking about it a little more, I realized that's not really the case. We do have some pretty powerful abilities with the darkness subclasses. I mean, each of the supers are strong in their own way. Silence and Squall is pretty good for a burst super, and Silk Strike is a pretty well-rounded roaming super and has had a time to shine with the Edge of Fate. Glacial Quake has its niche scenarios, but when in those scenarios performs exceptionally well, and Blade Fury is alright and fairly tuned, albeit slightly below where I think it should be. Winter's Wrath is actually a somewhat decent roaming super when used correctly, and Needle Storm is a quite strong burst super that is somewhat competitive actually. The melees and grenades all have their strengths as well, but with only 3 grenades available and only 1 melee available to each class, they can feel repetitive and lack the unique value that they once had. I mean, what'd you expect from playing with the same ability for years? So instead of going into unnecessary depth about the current abilities, how about we brainstorm some new ones instead? The way this section will go is I'll explain the new super idea, then the melee, and then move on to the next class, and at the end the grenades, since those are shared between the classes. So starting with Stasis Hunter, since we have a burst super already, we should focus on the roaming super to balance them out, since that's what the other subclasses do anyways. Stasis Hunter seems to lean heavily into Japanese weaponry, with the super being a pair of kamas, and having shurikens as the melee. So doing some research into Japanese weaponry myself, I found a potential candidate, that being a Kusari Gama. I apologize if I butcher the pronunciation of anything. This weapon seems to be a flail type weapon, where the Kusarigama is a modified Kama. Now, the idea I have with this is summoning a big double-handed version, and using it to swing and wrap around enemies. For red and orange bar enemies, there's an AoE swing that wraps around a group of them, pulling them tight and shatters them, releasing slowing stasis shards to other nearby enemies, or if there aren't any, homing towards you and giving stacks of frost armor. If instead it's used on a boss or mini-boss, you instead get pulled into them, and once close enough, the chain shatters into the same stasis projectiles as mentioned before that do the same thing, and then you deal rapid strikes with the blade, stunning them and dealing very quick DPS. Since we have a long-range melee, to balance it out we could have a close-range melee. A simple idea could just be an icicle-like weapon where, when impaled into an enemy, slows them over time and eventually freezes them, with the time it takes to freeze different level enemies changing. Lower tier enemies slow at 50 stacks per second, while higher tier enemies takes longer to freeze at 20 stacks per second. For extra utility, you could have this melee stun both overloads and unstops. Stasis Titan is all about making those nice and pure blue crystals as often as possible, whether that be through melees, grenades, or supers. So playing off that idea, we have a roaming super already, so let's think of a burst super instead. Upon activation, slam both of your fists into the ground and have dozens of thin ice spikes impale any enemies inside the radius of the super. Spikes deal massive damage to bosses and shatter after a couple seconds, doing even more damage. Spikes also stun, exhaust, and freeze boss level enemies. Have a miniature version of the Super Slam from Glacial Quake but as a melee, where when activated, slams you on the ground if you're in the air, or if on the ground already, slams your fist into the ground, dealing very small AoE damage around you, and firing out a single large stasis crystal towards an enemy that functions a lot like a normal stasis crystal. Freezes the target it hits and activates stasis crystal shattering. Stasis Warlock seems to be heavily into the summoner playstyle of wizard type setup, with staff magic and summoning turrets along with tracking freezing projectiles. My thought with Warlock would be to create a large AoE blizzard that rains down stasis hail shards onto enemies, slowing them with 35 stacks of slow each hit. When placed on a boss level enemy, each tick of damage with the hail increases the rain speed up to 50% more frequency. Storm lasts around 18.5 seconds. For the melee, upon activation, make a vortex of slowing, damaging wind that, on use, immediately consumes 20% of your melee and then slowly drains the rest, for a max use time of 4.5 seconds. Can be cancelled early to save melee energy, and slows enemies at a rate of 45 stacks per second, enough to shatter twice per full activation. Gotta be honest and say it's kinda hard to come up with new grenades, since what could you do to a new nade that the other nades don't do as of now? Regardless, here's what I came up with. Frost Grenade. Similar to the Healing Grenade on Solar, upon activation releases stasis shrapnel almost in a similar pattern to the Swarm Grenade that home onto allies and yourself and gives 1 stack of frost armor per segment. The Touch of Winter Hunter aspect increases the amount of shrapnel released. Frozen Shrapnel Grenade. Similar to an Incendiary Grenade on Solar, throw a grenade that acts similarly to the Incendiary Grenade, but instead explodes into stasis shrapnel that shatters enemies on death. But the grenade and the shatters it causes would stack against enemies. The Touch of Winter Hunter aspect causes a second delayed explosion that is effectively half the power of the first one. And lastly, Pillar Grenade. Similar to the Titan Super idea I said earlier, throw a marker at a surface or onto an enemy, and after a quarter of a second of it detecting that it is indeed on an enemy or a surface, spawn an ice spike that can impale, freeze, and then shatter enemies. The Touch of Winter Hunter aspect causes 3 spikes to emerge instead of 1. Strand Hunter again seems to be inspired by Japanese weaponry with its kunai and rope dart. However, my idea with the super sort of differs from this. What if your shadow clones, the ones you make with Threaded Spectre, could attack? Upon activation, creates 3 Threaded Spectre clones that surround the player and will actively attack anything they detect. If the player is actively attacking an enemy, the clones shift their focus onto whatever enemy it is. Will continue to attack until another target is attacked. Super clones have slightly more health than regular clones and also sever targets on hit. Having it synergize with the aspect by using your class ability while clones are up spawns another clone that could also attack. Since they are essentially the same as regular clones, enemies would attack them and take some of the gunfire away from the user. The clones last around 20 seconds and their DPS would be comparable to that of a Thunder Crash. Since again, we already have a long-range melee with the kunai, we balance it out with a close-range one. So, how about a close-range Strand Sai? No, not that kind, SAI, not PSI. Hitting an enemy severs and exhausts them, however deals massively increased damage if the melee is from behind the enemy, also unravels them if hitting a backstab. Little unrelated side note, but don't know where else to put this. I thought I remembered a D1 exotic that did something similar to this, but I guess I was wrong. However, I stumbled upon Destiny Game Wiki because I was trying to look for it and found something even more interesting. I have no idea how credible of a source this website is, but it says there was a cut exotic from D1 Year 1 for Hunter called Exotac Angel Hunter, and clicking on it said that it would increase your accuracy when you jumped. Now, if I remember correctly, accuracy was basically aim assist since everyone was on controller, so for it to significantly increase that just for jumping, yeah, I can see why it was cut. Anyways, back to the video. Strand Titan's all about aggression, and being in the battle at all times, tanking everything and outputting massive damage with its 3 melees, melee buffs, and melee-based abilities including its super, grapple melee, and multiple aspects surrounding the playstyle. So for the super, I seem to remember an idea about a second super, or maybe a theory about what the super was supposed to be when Lightfall launched, where the super was converting yourself into a Strand minigun. And honestly, why not? Upon activation, summon a Strand minigun that shoots hit-scan Strand projectiles that unravel and sever targets they hit. Suspended enemies take more damage, last around 15 seconds, and movement speed is slightly less than walking speed. Damage could be comparable to a base marksman Goldie with all 3 precision shots hit. The target suspended the entire time it's fired at, damage could be the same if not more than a Nighthawk Goldie. Similar to the Berserker super having the slashes that suspend targets, have a slightly weaker version as a new melee. Upon activation, cut through space and launch out a suspending Strand slash that travels until it hits an enemy. On hit, suspends the target and has slight AoE. Each enemy that's suspended will give 5 to 20% of the melee back, depending on the level of the enemy and how many enemies are hit. If Stasis Warlock was themed around Summoner playstyle, then Strand Warlock takes that to 11 and makes it the sole identity with Threadling spam everywhere. So if it's all supposed to be about Threadlings, why not become the Threadling? Upon activation, you surround your body with a thick exoskeleton formed from Strand. Cannot use weapons, and your melee and grenade are replaced with special abilities. Using your grenade sends out a swarm of 5 high-damaging Threadlings towards a target. Using your melee performs a dash that punctures enemies and leaves them severed. Your movement speed is about the same as when you're in Weavelock as you surf the Threadlings you ride on. Threadlings from your super travel faster but in a narrower line and angle than the grenade counterpart. Come out of your super with 5 perched Threadlings. Super lasts about 25 seconds without doing anything, but using your abilities consumes super energy. Similar to how Life Drain from D1 worked, upon hitting an enemy while shields are broken, instantly gain back a chunk of shields, while at 90% shields or more, gain Woven Mail instead for 10 seconds. For the first Strand grenade, we have the Tangle grenade. Similar to Wanderer Tangles, upon activation, shoot out a smaller sized tangle at a fixed speed in a straight line. Can be shot at midair or left to eventually stick to a surface. Sticks to a surface for about 3.5 seconds or until an enemy walks by it or it is shot at. When it explodes, dozens of Strand projectiles erupt from all sides and have slight tracking towards enemies. Unravels enemies hit by at least half of the projectiles. The Mind Spun Invocation Warlock aspect gives unraveling rounds to Strand weapons for 20 seconds. The next grenade is the Snare Grenade. Upon activation, deploys 4 lines of Strand energy in an X pattern shape. Enemies that walk into the lines get snared by strands from the ground and are trapped in place. When held for a second, they get severed. Grenade lasts 6.5 seconds. Very similar to the Wishkeeper exotic bow trait. The Mind Spun Invocation Warlock aspect makes it so precision kills creates a single line of snare towards another enemy that lasts 3.25 seconds and has a cooldown of 4.5 seconds. This effect lasts 23 seconds. And finally, the Sever Grenade. Upon activation, throws out a storm of Strand projectiles that slow down enemies that walk through it and also severs enemies. Storm is similar to that of the Duskfield Grenade of Stasis, but Strand. Lasts as long as the Duskfield Grenade at around 7.5 seconds. The Mind Spun Invocation Warlock aspect provides the ability to create a severing burst on precision kills or multi-kills with weapons. And with that, that concludes all the ideas for new abilities for the Darkness subclasses. A new super for each class, a new melee, and 3 new grenades with their buffed counterpart for the respective aspects. The Darkness subclasses aren't necessarily bad, but definitely just need updated and need to have something new added to them that is not only different and separates itself from Prismatic, but also strong enough to where maybe it sees more light in in-game content, other than Shatter Skating or Grapple Melee. There's always been the potential there, but again, hasn't really been innovated in over 2 years. However, I suspect the reason for this is simply for the fact that both Strand and Stasis are locked behind a paywall that many players probably haven't paid, and as such, they give everything they can to the free classes because that's what the majority of players have access to. But that's only a suspicion. Anyways, what are your thoughts on them? Do they really need changed or added on? Or are they fine the way they are now? What abilities would you add if you could add to them? Well, anyways, until next time, see ya.